So anyways, John, I will turn this over to you now. Really excited to experience your discussion today.
Excellent. Well, thank you, and thank you to everyone on the call. Serious injury and fatality prevention is certainly something that is important to all safety professionals, so I appreciate the opportunity to share some of our story with you today. So just to kind of kick things off, I'll give you a little bit of information about Potash Corp. We are the largest fertilizer company by capacity. We operate 16 sites in Canada, the United States, and in Trinidad. We have 6 underground potash mines in Canada that produce potash. We have 2 large phosphate mines, one in North Carolina, one in White Springs, Florida. We have 4 nitrogen facilities that produce anhydrous ammonia and downstream derivative products from that, and we have 4 small feed sites. So very comprehensive company. We're governed both in the U.S. by OSHA, MSHA, the Coast Guard. So very, very diverse company with a lot of complex operations. Our story in serious injury and fatality prevention really started back in 2010, and when we kicked this off, we started the process with 6 other companies in a BST study, and this initial work was very much reactive based. You know, we wanted to kind of start to get our hands around what exposure do we have as a company. We started to believe that we were seeing a disproportionate reduction in serious injuries and fatalities and that exposure than we were with some of our other safety efforts. So we started this study. It was really all about increasing our visibility and understanding, you know, where we were at the time. So that initial work really was all about just starting to get some basic understanding around serious injury and fatality prevention. We started knowing that we needed to increase our injury and incident reporting. I think that's step one, is to be able to make sure that everything gets reported. You can't really do anything with things that you don't know about. So we had a big push and a big focus for everything to be reported. When we started looking through our data, what was very clear to us once we started organizing this data and getting some consistency around how we viewed the data was that one of the main things that come up on almost every near miss or incident that had SIF exposure was failure to identify the hazard. So early on, we put a lot of effort into making sure that we had good pre-task risk assessments in place, and that's kind of where we started on the journey. And then also helping people understand that you can stop the job, and that started from our leadership, our GMs, all the way down to our frontline employees, making sure they understood if it's not right, then certainly let's pause and make sure that we have a good understanding. The other piece was around incident investigation. What we've learned through reviewing our data is we had way too many repeat occurrences, and we knew that we needed to get our hands around that. So we started making sure that we put a strong focus on incident investigation, making sure that we had really good corrective actions that were focused on engineering or substitution, elimination of the hazard, and not just putting in administrative controls that, you know, months down the road we were going to experience the same occurrence.
Hi.
So out of that initial work, we did see some quick successes. We started to get our hands around identifying SIF potential by site, and each site developing their own intervention strategies. We did standardize the categories of how we viewed this data when we did have a near miss or an event, and we started to get some consistency around how we approach SIF prevention in Potash Corp. With the successes, we also identified some challenges. You know, certainly we knew that if we were going to be consistent, we were going to need some definitions and also a good decision matrix to make sure that we could identify this potential. We also understood we had limited resources. This is really a bandwidth issue. Prior to doing all of this work around serious injury and fatality prevention, anytime we had a recordable injury, and it could be 2 stitches, that required a full taproot investigation. And when we started getting feedback from the sites, what we found was that we were overwhelming our site teams with investigations, and really started to run up against the capacity issue to where we're rushing through these taproot investigations just to get the quantity done we needed to get done versus being able to really focus on the things that mattered most. So we took a step back and said, okay, we're going to do full taproot investigations on anything with SIF potential, but some of these other events where, yes, it might be recordable, but the root cause is pretty obvious, we can look at a different methodology to try to take some of that burden off the sites, and that has been wildly successful for us. That was very much welcomed by our sites, and it's been very effective. We did recognize consistently determining SIF potential across the sites can be a challenge. That's where that decision matrix comes in, and it's so very important. And we started to realize that reactive SIF is incredibly important, but it's only one piece of the puzzle. And really that came to light when we started to realize that if we're going to just solely rely on reactive data, near-miss events, and respond to those to prevent serious injuries and fatalities, eventually we're going to experience serious injuries and fatalities. Oftentimes the difference between a near-miss and an actual event can be inches or luck. And nobody in our organization wanted to rely on luck as our prevention strategy for serious injuries and fatalities. And really where this came into, this really came into light was if you go back to 2014, and just to back up a little bit, we implemented a strategy beginning 2013 where we wanted to be one of the safest resource companies in the world in the next 5 years, and we put a ton of effort into that strategy. We were focused on our management systems, our metrics, employee contractor engagement, and training capability building, and we were doing a lot of really good things right. And fourth quarter 2014, we saw our best safety performance on record, and we were feeling very good about the strategy. We felt like that a lot of the things that we had put in place were starting to work, and that we were seeing a big turnaround in both our recordable incident rate and also our lost time incident rate. And at the end of fourth quarter 2014, really feeling pretty solid about the strategy, and going into the new year, felt like we're in a good place. January 26, 2015, that really our mindset totally shifted. On that date, we experienced a fatality at our Florida operation, and it really kind of shook us to the core. We were very focused. We felt like we had a good strategy. We were seeing all our leading indicators, our lagging indicators, all going in the right direction, but yet we had this fatality. And what was significant about this is this particular fatality happened in one of the most routine jobs that we do at that site. And a few weeks later, following that event, we had 2 lost time injuries at one of our Canadian operations that, in all reality, could have been fatalities as well, again, doing some very, very routine operations. And at that particular job, we had a practical trainer, we had a supervisor present, we had 2 new employees, and we were following the procedure. We were doing things the way that we thought we should do it. But we were missing something. And if you go back to the traditional safety pyramid, certainly we're starting to understand now that we may be missing some things with this, just based on oftentimes the same things that reduce the minor injuries are not the same things that reduce the exposure for serious injuries and fatalities. And that really came to light in these 3 incidents that I'll talk about. A lot of the research points to the potential for serious injuries is low for the majority of non-SIF injuries, about 80%. But there are some exposures out there that go right to the top of the triangle, and that was the case for these 3 injuries that I've described. And we started to realize that we're missing something, we need to be able to try to get out in front of this exposure before we're just reliant on a near-miss event to help us identify that exposure. So what we did after the 2 lost time injuries in Allen, or at one of our potash sites, we brought in a team of folks from our corporate group and said, we just want to understand how the job's done. So we went in and we watched this particular job start to finish. And after that, you know, the team said, that's pretty interesting. We'd like to see it on a different shift. So they did that, and then they ended up watching this particular job on all 4 shifts, and then they went to 2 other sites and they watched the same job start to finish on each shift at those sites. And what they found was incredibly interesting is we did the same 5 or 6 steps in that particular job, every shift, every site, but we did them in different order. And just the nuance of doing them in a different order had a huge impact on the exposure associated with that job. So we got incredible learnings out of that, and we made that job much safer across all the sites. But when we took that back, we thought, we think we're onto something here, but we have thousands and thousands and thousands of routine tasks. How do we do something like this, in a way that is sustainable and practical, and we can make that work? So when we started thinking through that, we took another step back and said, we think we need to revisit our strategy, and we need a more holistic approach. Reactive is incredibly important. It will always be incredibly important. It's really the basis of our strategy to make sure that everything gets reported, everything gets investigated, and that we do a good job with that. We prevent reoccurrence and we learn from near misses. I often say they're a gift, and certainly we need to fully leverage that. But at the same time, we also need an ability to get out in front of this. So that's where we started looking at how do we have a proactive strategy. And the last piece of the strategy is just centered around it only works if everybody in the organization is engaged in this. And we knew that we needed to be able to market this a bit, and that serious injury and fatality prevention needed to be involved in every conversation we have about safety, whether it's through our exposure-based safety process, whether it's through safety meetings, whether it's through our occupational safety and health committees. All of these different safety groups, safety teams, safety processes need to be talking about serious injury and fatality prevention. So that's the third piece of the strategy. So when we look at our overall strategy, it starts with our reactive, and as we've already talked about, that's all about making sure everything gets reported regardless of how minor. Once it does get reported, we take a systematic way to look, does this have stiff potential through a decision matrix? If it does, it gets a very comprehensive investigation. We make sure that we have good corrective actions in place for each root cause. Ideally, we want an engineering substitution or elimination control for every root cause of these SIF events when we can, and we drive that as a leading indicator across the company. It has to, certainly include every level of the organization, and we have to involve all of our workers in the process. On the proactive side, we call this SIF in the routine, and this is all about being able to take that proactive view and look out front and say, what exposure do we have in some of these routine tasks, and how do we identify it? It's really all about trying to weaken that cultural blindness and normalization of deviation, and we'll talk more about that in the coming slides, but that's something that happens to us all, and we have to look out for that. We want to compile these exposures, share them across the sites, make sure that we include remediation and we track it, and certainly one thing we found that's been the most beneficial to this entire process is involving all workers in the process. So we get a team together, and that's been pretty powerful because it really starts to shift the whole conversation at our sites. And then the final piece of the strategy is focused on integration. And that's, as we've already talked about, is just making sure that we create this SIF prevention thinking throughout the entire organization. And that's with our all of our different safety processes, whether it's our JHA process, safety meetings, audits, area inspections, our leadership out in the field, everybody talking the same message around serious injury and fatality prevention. So getting into the proactive piece just in a little more detail, what we found when we started looking at these routine work is oftentimes we just missed the exposure. You know, it may have been a job that we've done every single day for the past 30 years, and it's just the way that we had been accustomed to doing it. And it's kind of akin to two fish in a fishbowl, and one says, you know, how do you like the water, and the other says, water, what water? It's certainly easy enough to miss. One of the things that we tell our folks is, if you ever hear the statement, we've always done it this way, or we've done it this way for the past 30 years, that should raise a red flag and say, okay, whoa, you know, are we missing anything here? Is there anything that we might have missed that we could do differently? And so that's been pretty powerful for us, is just to try to help folks realize that, you know, just because it's always been done that way doesn't mean that there's not something that we've missed. And at one of our sites, when we rolled this program out, one of the people shared a story that I thought did a great job of kind of summing up what this means. And he said that his one of his family members was a tree surgeon, and what he did is he went in, and, you know, these trees that were too close to people's houses, he would take these trees down. And this guy was you know, really good at his job, very professional. So this particular day, he had cut this tree down, and he said, you know, he had, for years and years, he kind of felt like that once he got the tree on the ground, the biggest hazards were over. So he had cut this tree, the tree had fell, turned off his chainsaw, he was going to walk back to the truck to put his chainsaw on the truck and go eat some lunch. And as he was walking by one of the limbs that was under pressure kind of freed itself, and it struck him, pinned him to the ground, and ended up breaking his back. He later recovered, but he said, you know, that for years he had done this job and was totally focused on getting that tree on the ground, and once that happened, he felt like the exposure was over, but had completely missed this other exposure. And that's really what we're trying to focus on at our sites with this proactive SIF, is to be able to identify those things that may have been hidden or missed for many, many years. And there's a lot of things that cause that. You know, certainly the biggest impact here is our risk perception, our risk tolerance, and there's lots of things that affect that. You know, certainly risk-return trade-offs. You know, you think about a great example is if you're trying to eat right. You know, certainly eating a donut has immediate gratification, whereas making the better choices sometimes is a long-term thing. So the same things happens at our sites. So we want to be mindful of that. Certainly normalized deviance comes into play here. You know, we take a shortcut, we get away with it, and then, you know, we keep kind of pushing the envelope until something happens. And then the last piece of that is just the whole idea that the more we do something, our brains can kick over to autopilot, and oftentimes there's things that we miss associated with that. So we won't spend a lot of time here, but you know, certainly there's lots of things that affect how we view risk, and that goes back to that conversation around immediate rewards versus kind of the long-term thing. Certainly culture has a big impact. You think about how we bring people on, how we train, how we introduce new people to the processes. You know, if there are bad habits on that shift, oftentimes they can get passed along unknowingly. They think they're doing the right thing, but it gets continued to be passed on to the new folks. And experience, you know, certainly has a big impact. You think about how the more we do something, the more comfortable we become with that perception of risk. Another big piece for us when we started working through this proactive SIF prevention was just looking at this whole idea of how people remain focused and what is their perception of hazards. And we included this model in the process. And the way this kind of works, if you think about a new employee coming into the organization, they typically come into the organization in that bottom left-hand quadrant where they don't know what they don't know. And certainly there's a big risk associated with that. If you don't recognize the hazard, sometimes you can get yourself in trouble. But the longer, as they start to learn more, they move up into this conscious incompetence piece where now they know what they don't know. And typically we see good safety performance there. People are cautious and they know, hey, I don't know this, so I should go get help, and let's make sure that we have the right folks involved in identifying the hazards. The more training and competence we get, we shift over into this conscious competence, and that's where we know what we know. And really, that's another place where we see great safety performance. And now we know what we know, we're focused. But the more we do any particular task, oftentimes we can shift over into this unconscious competence piece. And if you think about it, I'm sure everybody on the call at some time has driven home or driven somewhere and ended up getting to the destination and not really remembering how you got there. And the reason that happens is that the brain is pretty miraculous in the fact that it builds these pathways to shift us over to autopilot, and it does that to conserve energy. Certainly our brains are always thinking, and it's always looking for more efficient ways to do things. So the more we do something, it's a natural physiological thing for us to start to develop those neurological pathways that shift us over into that autopilot phase. So we started thinking about how we proactively combat this, doing this at our operations. We started to think, well, what can we do about that? And that's where we thought, we need another step to this ladder, and that's that mindful competence piece. And to combat this, the way we did that is we created a process called frequent and structured pausing. And what we ask folks to do is, on a very routine basis, just take a pause, 30, 45 seconds, and ask yourself the question, am I focused? Is my mind drifting to, the 40 things I got to do after work today, the holidays coming, those kind of things. And we ask people to do that as both individuals and as a group. Certainly if the conditions change, we want people to take a pause, and we're using that to try to shift people back over into this idea of mindful competence. So kind of summing this up a little bit, we know that reactive serious injury and fatality prevention is incredibly important. It's the rearview mirror. I think that nobody on the call would want to take a road trip without the rearview mirror. It's in an automobile. It's incredibly important. It helps us to see and react to the things that have happened, but at the same time, if we're totally dependent upon a reactive strategy, we know that there's going to be things that we miss, and we certainly don't want to leave this up to chance or leave it up to luck. So we need to be looking out the windshield, and that's where the proactive piece comes into play. And we'll talk a little bit about how this process works. It really starts with a cross-functional team, and typically we have a team of 12 to 15 people that are really the experts at the site, and they lead the process, and then we'll talk about here in just a slide or two how that works. But kind of backing up just a little bit, as we started through this process, we have engaged a lot of experts in the field, one being Todd Conklin. A lot of folks on the phone will be familiar with Todd Conklin, but we took his principles and wanted to make sure that they incorporated into the process. The first being, we're fixated on where the next failure would happen. As we go out and we do these audits at the sites, one of the first principles we tell these audit teams is, ask the operators, what keeps you up at night? Where do you think, if you were going to identify where the next serious incident is going to happen in your work, where would that be? And that has been really powerful, because the folks that do the work oftentimes, they know where there could be issues. The second thing is we constantly strive to reduce complicated operations. I can't say enough about this. This has been incredibly powerful for us. If you think about that, you know, certainly the simpler we can make things, the better our chances for success. A great example of this is you think about when we moved over to a DCS system to alarm our plants. Now we have the ability to basically have unlimited alarms. So if a high-level alarm was good, then a high-level alarm would be better. So oftentimes we'll have a tank that may have a high-level alarm, a high-level alarm, and then an interlock. And then, you know, we'll overflow a tank and ask the question, how does that happen? Well, as we make these operations more complicated, what typically happens is an operator gets a high-level alarm. Well, they know they have another one, so they just acknowledge that, and nothing gets done about it. And then one of those, the secondary alarms fail, and we have an issue. So as we best we can, the more simple, uncomplicated we can keep our operations, the higher our chances for success. We certainly want to respond to events deliberately. If people tell us something, we want to make sure that we take that seriously. And probably one of the most important things is we respond to low-level signals seriously. If something gets reported, we take the time to really dig into that and not just stop at, well, that doesn't make sense. If it makes sense to one person, it's probably at some point going to make sense to someone else. So the way this process works is essentially just a structured way to go out and look at routine tasks start to finish. So we have this team of what we call the audit working group, which is 12 to 15 individuals. They meet once a month. They intake tasks from all various different resources. It can be from leadership. It could be from any of our other safety processes. And they determine this month we think we're going to go look at this job. And they'll pick 1 to 2 people from the working group that will go out and get 2 people totally unfamiliar with the process, and they'll form a team. And on that team, we want somebody that's the subject matter expert, and then we want 2 people from outside of that area that's never really, not all that familiar with the task that they're being assessed on. So we have that fresh set of eyes to see those things that if you're immersed in that every day you might miss. So this team, they complete the audit. They audit it start to finish. They bring it back to the working group. They determine, did they identify anything where they feel like there was some CIF exposure? If they do, they determine appropriate follow-up. That gets passed up to the steering team, which is typically the general manager and his senior leadership team. Once they agree, then it comes back to the working group, and they go out and they communicate to the people in the field that they watch that task start to finish, what they found, what they're going to do about it, and they have that follow-up piece. And then the last piece is just making sure we monitor for success. And we won't spend a lot of time on this side, but what's important here is that in Potash Corp, we're very focused on building a stage 4 safety culture. And when we created this process, we wanted to create it with that in mind, that it is transformational. It's leaders looking out for leaders, and we believe that every employee in Potash Corp is a safety leader. We like to say we're 5,000 safety leaders strong. So we took that mindset as we created this proactive CIF process to make sure that it was something that was owned by the folks on the floor, and they're looking out for themselves and they're looking out for each other. And then the very last piece here, before we kind of jump into some questions, is just the integration piece. And that's all about incorporating serious injury and fatality prevention into everything that we do. And that's making sure that every day it's part of the conversation, whether it's a kickoff toolbox meeting, it's part of the JHA, it's part of senior leaders in the field walking around. We want to make sure that it's being promoted, it's part of the conversation. If we're doing a pre-job hazard assessment, at some point during that conversation, we want to ask the question, if I could be seriously injured or killed doing this job, how's it going to happen, and am I protected against that? And that's really the focus that we have for this. So it has been incredibly successful for us. It's created a level of engagement in safety that we haven't seen before. Folks are are starting to bring things, just, you know, frontline workers bringing things to our SIF working groups saying, hey, I think there may be SIF exposure with this. It'd be great if your team can come take a look at it. So the integration piece has been one of the things that I think is most important, that it just becomes part of our conversation and we got everybody kind of focused going the same direction. And the quote on the bottom here is one of my favorite quotes, is, if I would have had more time, I would have written a shorter letter. And that's one thing in our SIF prevention efforts that we found is pretty important, is, you know, oftentimes we overcomplicate things. You know, so we started taking a look at some of our procedures. We would find that we had a 10-page procedure that we could say in a page and a half. And the more complication, as we talked about earlier, that we can take out of things, the better our chance for success, because it's easy to remember. It helps people focus on the right things. And on the right side of this slide, you can see our 4 key safety priorities. And what that is we've basically taken our entire safety strategy and we've broken that down into 4 key priorities. And the reason we did that is we wanted every employee in the organization to easily know and be able to recite, this is what I should be focused on, and this is how I engage in safety every single day. And that's our job hazard assessments, is making sure that we're looking for the hazard before we start work, that we're taking the time to pause, you know, that we keep serious injury and fatality prevention front and center into everything we do, and then that whole idea that everybody is a safety leader and we're all responsible, not just for ourselves, but for each other. And probably the most important part of the entire conversation is that we know that we're valuable, we're vulnerable. You know, we have since we've started down this path, we've seen some very good performance. Our last fatality was January 26, 2015. But at the same time, we know that we've had many significant near misses where we had the potential for a much more serious event. And we want our employees to embrace that vulnerability every single day. We're only as good as our safety performance today, and that is totally reliant and dependent on everybody in this organization engaging in the process. And our theme for safety in Potash Corp is every moment matters. And, you know, really we strive every day to make sure every employee knows that we absolutely can work safe, and you know, we believe that we can achieve no harm. And oftentimes people get kind of confused by that conversation, because you know, so you're saying that you know, we can not hurt people, and we said, well, we absolutely believe that. And you know, and oftentimes we'll ask the conversation, well, do you think you can work safe for the next hour? And inevitably the answer is always yes, and well, the next day, the next week, and we've proven that out. And so what we like to make sure that we keep the focus on is what matters is the moment we're in right now. And as long as we keep that front and center and we engage in these 4 key safety priorities, we're going to see safety success. So with that, I will pause right there and we can open it up to any questions.
Thank you, John. That was excellent. I will kick off the question and answers with one of my own. I'm just wondering, what's some of the feedback that you get from site employees that are involved in this process, and then maybe secondarily, you know, buy-in from your lead people or foremen? Have they found this to be beneficial to them, or you know, more work for them, I guess is?
That is a great question. You know, initially, I think some of the feedback is, well, this is going to create, you know, additional work. But I think as people have gotten into it, they start to realize that we're identifying things that make their jobs easier. And I'll give you a specific example. At one of our sites, we had on one of the first audits, the team wanted to go out and look at this bridge, and what happens at this particular bridge is the town above, there's a river that runs through the site, and when they get a lot of heavy rain, it washes a lot of debris down the river, and if they don't take off like the guardrails on this bridge, so it catches debris and it can flood the town above us, and they get really persnickety about that. So for the last 30 years, as the river started to rise, the practice has been to take heavy equipment down and remove these guardrails off of the bridge. So during this first audit, one of the frontline employees said, well, I was driving back from a trip the other day, and he said, you know, what about the cables on the highway that serve as the guardrails? So that started a conversation, and 20 minutes later, they kind of designed a new guardrail system that could be lowered from the side of the bank without anybody ever getting on the bridge. Cost about $1,800. It took this job from taking 4 or 5 hours to something that could be done in 20 minutes with totally mitigated, you know, significant exposure, just getting those frontline workers involved in the conversation and talking about it. And our frontline, you know, our foremen and our frontline leaders have just totally embraced this. I think one of the most important pieces to this that we found has really engaged that buy-in is we've been very careful as we've launched this program to every site to say, let's make sure that we only focus on 1 or 2 audits a month, because yes, you could go out and audit a lot of things, but what happens is the more things you identify, then you start to back up the site's ability to deal with those, and that's when you start to lose credibility. So we're very focused on we identify something and we fix it, and that has brought a ton of credibility to as we, you know, kind of close that loop and go back and have that conversation with the people that we worked with, that if we identify things, we're going to fix it.
Great, thanks, John. Anyone else have any questions?
Hi, this is Tom Wynn. Can you hear me?
Go ahead.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thanks for the presentation. It was really good. I was wondering a couple things. One, I couldn't see it, unfortunately. I think I had a problem with my computer. I didn't know if it was if the slides were available or not. If they are, it'd be great, because I'd like to go through and see what the visuals were. But my other, I guess it's a comment and
I'm in the middle of the conference call. They're just out doing the questions and answers. So
actually, I've only got 7 minutes or so. I have
question.
Archive 26 and.
All right, I hear other people talking. Can you hear me?
I can't hear you. Yes, sir.
All right. We're in a couple of different behavior-based safety programs.
You grow them? Okay.
My garden's paying out like crazy. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
As we can hear you, can everybody put their...
Like this dry spell, has that been good for them or bad for them, where you keep them on?
Peppers don't care that much.
Try to keep going. I'll try to louder. But we're doing a program called Safe Start, and a lot of what you're talking about sounds a lot like Safe Start, with complacency and eyes on task, mind on task, making sure that you're focused. It's really cool. I like the spin that you had on it. Have you ever seen the program Safe Start? Have you any familiarity with it?
I hate to admit, I didn't even know it, but happy birthday.
I haven't. You know, I've had a few different, the NSC and a couple things. I you know, saw some of their information on their booth, but not very familiar with what it is, but it does sound...
I bet you got more white up there than I do.
I do. It's definitely, I got a haircut the other day.
I don't wear a beard anymore, though, because it is just white as can be. Yeah, it looks like an old dog.
Gone.
They've unmuted them.
Actually, I've got to go over to 226 and buck some boxes. So I ran.
Okay.
Yeah, that's much better.
I don't know which one he is, so no.
John, can you maybe just answer what part of the question that you heard there?
Okay, so can you hear me? I guess you can. Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So the question was around Safe Start as far as familiarity. I'm not all that familiar with Safe Start. I certainly have seen their booth at some, like the Safety Congress, but have never really had the opportunity to kind of dig into their material. But I will say, I think the idea of mindfulness and focus is something that, has to be core and fundamental to any successful safety program. If you think about just how busy everybody is today, and with we're all connected to a mobile device, and lots of things going on, and oftentimes people don't get enough sleep and fatigue, and there's lots of things that create distractions. Being able to try to come up with any kind of structured way to bring people back to being focused is incredibly important.
Great, thanks, John. Along those same lines, your frequent structured pausing program, is that something that you just let people decide how often they need to do that, or do you have guidelines on how many times a day they should, or?
Yeah, we kind of leave that up to each individual, but we do want the group to kind of take some routine frequent pauses, and typically we ask them to do that at critical steps in the process to identify that on the pre-job hazard assessment of where would be a good spot to take a pause. Certainly, if any conditions change, let's say it starts to rain or someone new joins the work area, we ask them to take a pause. But on the personal focus side, we kind of leave that up to each individual. And it's really just been more an awareness campaign for us than anything, is just to try to encourage folks to stay focused and make sure that they understand that we want to make sure that we're focused on the task at hand. And the other piece that we've kind of incorporated into that is something we picked up from David Marquet, and some folks might be familiar with David, but is asking if there's 2 or 3 people working in a work group to the concept of deliberate action. So before they take a critical step, to announce that out loud, I'm going to do X, Y, Z. And that's been really helpful because it allows folks to, maybe there's somebody that's done that 5 years ago that something bad happened, that can say, wait, stop, here's what happened before, and there's a better way to do that.
Excellent, thank you. And I'm not sure if someone from NSC can answer the question as to whether the slides will be available. I know the webinar is being recorded,